Should American employers continue to have the right to bring in foreign labor, fire American workers, and make those American workers train their replacements? Kevin Lynn says no. He's the founder of U.S. Tech Workers, and he's joining me to discuss an amazing achievement that happened in Tennessee last week. You know, I've been at this for a long time. I remember back in the late 1990s when AIG Insurance, first there was a major report on this, fired American workers, required them to sign these agreements of non-disclosure, and they had to train their replacements, and then they were given severance and never heard from again. And for decades, we've been looking at trying to ways to stop this abuse of the H-1B program, which is part of a process of technology theft, outsourcing. Many of these immigration problems are interrelated to different components of the visa process and outsourcing, so they're not often standalone issues. We're here to explain to us what Kevin Lynn did and what his group did working with the tech workers at Tennessee Valley Authority, which ultimately landed him and these workers in the White House for an Oval Office meeting. Kevin, how'd you find out about what was going on at the Tennessee Valley Authority?
Right, that's actually a great place to start this conversation, Dan, because it's really a series of fortunate events. I found out about what was going on at TVA through an Intercept article. And I made contact with the union rep. We spoke for a while. I then had a conversation with former Senator Jeff Sessions. He had called me to get some advice on H-1B visa programs. I had mentioned this to him, and he said, wow, I'm going to talk to them. So he did, and he actually spoke at they held a protest in Huntsville, Alabama, and he invited me down to speak as a subject matter expert on H-1B visas, and that's where I got to meet the workers. And then driving back to Pennsylvania through the beautiful Shenandoah Valley, I got the idea to do an ad. And the more I looked into it, and I saw the disparities. One, when you look at a new CEO who they recently brought on, he hadn't even done a full year at TVA, whose total compensation, so we're looking at, he makes about $920,000 a year in salary, about $1 million more in bonuses. There's a couple different bonus pools, and then about $2 million in, because of GAAP, they have to report the future value of money as they're putting into the pension plan. So that combined with the pension plan that he was bringing over, about a total of $8 million in compensation for 2019. So not too shabby.
Oh, indeed.
And this is the guy, he and his CIO reached the decision to outsource their tech workers. And they were going to do this it's almost become rote at this point, because it was the exact same thing at SoCal Edison, PG&E, Northeast Utilities. They bring in the outsourcing for, in this case, firms. So instead of using just one firm, they were going to use the firms of Capgemini, the Accenture, CGI, and they already had two other firms in there. There's a few H-1B workers in there now. And these are all H-1B visa dependent firms, which means 15% of their personnel are here on H-1B visas. Now, in the case of these firms, it's much, much higher than that. So
I mean, so look, I'm an employee at TVA, and I've been working there a while now. TVA, this is chartered, I guess, by Congress. It's a government.
Right. It's a quasi non-governmental.
Franklin Roosevelt, right? I mean, it goes all the way back to Franklin Roosevelt. So it's American as apple pie. You are providing electricity, among other things, to the Tennessee Valley, a large part of the United States. And where do you get this idea that it's okay to just start firing American workers, swear them to secrecy as a condition of giving them a severance, and then bringing in foreign workers using these H-1B dependent contractors? These are generally Indian-owned companies that are full of H-1B workers that basically rent themselves out. They rent out these workers who come in. Where do you get this idea, after decades and decades of employing American workers, that this is okay?
Because this is the culture now among the different utilities. They've done it, and I will use the term unsuccessfully in so many other utilities, that this has almost become just a normal course of business. So that's where they get the idea that they can do it. But the reality is none of these outsourcings have gone well. In the case of Northeast Utilities, they fired the original outsourcing firm, brought in another one, fired them, and then brought in another one. So none of this works well. And it's largely because for some reason, Dan, they think that they can take 14, 7, 35 years of experience, cram it into a 3-month train the trainer exercise, and everything is going to be okay. And it's a recipe for disaster. And again, they think they can do it because this is how they've been schooled.
Well, how did you get, or I don't know who, but how did they get the workers, the actual Americans, to be willing to come publicly and admit what was going on? Because usually the companies bribe them into silence, pay them off. But in this case at TVA, the workers were willing to come out and oppose this. I mean, how did that happen?
Right. And that's part of that fortunate set of circumstances I mentioned earlier. They have a union rep. Now, when I first got wind of it, my first thought was, okay, it's time to do a walkout. If they're going to replace all 200 of you, well, it's time to walk out. And I was corrected because they're actually federal employees. So they're under the Taft-Hartley Act. They cannot strike. They cannot do this kind of disobedience. But fortunately, they do have a union rep. And that their union rep there is Gay Henson, and she's a fighter. She was just battling with management and their lack of transparency because they have to offer a transition plan, and they weren't being transparent. Because fortunately, there are some statutes that do require the ability to do collective bargaining, but also to enjoin with the workers to be involved in plans such as this. Now, interestingly enough, Dan, we know that there's always a big cost benefit when they do these outsourcing schemes. But in this case, they're actually saying, oh no, this will actually cost us more money, but we're doing it because these consulting firms have the latest and greatest technologies. And Dan, I bring this up because we've seen this at places like Anthem Insurance, and I call it demolition by neglect. So what they'll do with their American workers as they begin to bring in, as you mentioned perfectly well, like an Indian consulting firm like Cognizant, they'll bring these H-1B visa workers in, and they will put them on all the most sophisticated technology platforms, relegating the Americans to the more obsolete platforms. And they won't invest in their American workers, but they'll give their foreign workers all these training opportunities. And we were seeing this also at TVA, because just a few years before the former CIO, Chief Information Officer, was fired, he had a 3-year training plan to make sure everyone's skills were up to snuff, and they were looking at the more advanced platforms, and he got fired. So you can tell.
So in a sense, the pandemic has finally, ripped the Band-Aid off of this nonsense, and people are beginning to see that these H-1B programs are being used systematically across the country by firms to replace American workers. American workers are not getting the training opportunities. They're not getting the advancement opportunities. They're obviously, as a result of this, one would assume, in the aggregate, paying less to these H-1B workers over time. And in the end, also, the technology gets taken back to India eventually, which is one of the reasons that India likes using the H-1B program and works so hard to defend it. So then you have on two fronts, these H-1B workers now demanding that Congress remove the per country cap so that the H-1B workers can all get green cards, even though they were only brought here temporarily. You now have advocates like Mike Lee from Utah and others who want to blow the lid off the old per country limits that were put in place years ago to ensure a diversity under controlled numerical limits of immigration flows. And then on top of that, you finally see where this is happening all across the country. We now have a president who actually noticed you, so you made the decision to go ahead and run these ads, okay? And I think You had support from the workers over the idea. Did they agree with this?
Absolutely. Well, I did run the ad by the workers because we did want to keep something of a firewall between our activities and theirs. But they were more than happy to get the support from us. And we had some really creative folks on staff, used the Davis agency to help us as well. And we came up with an ad. And it was funny. President Trump actually scolded me a bit because he called it a vicious ad, but effective. Because what we knew ultimately—
Sounds like Davis and Company.
Right. We knew ultimately we had an audience of one, and that was Donald Trump. We had to get his attention. So we basically did a juxtaposition between his salary and the salary of the CEO at TVA. That's how we started. Then we went into the outsourcing. But in 30 seconds, we were able to use that ad pretty effectively. We put it on local broadcasts throughout the Tennessee Valley Authority and on cable news and in cable news in DC. And apparently that's where the president saw the ad. And I was having dinner about 9:30 at night, and my cell phone lit up. And Roger Ross, who works for me, finally gets through and says, "The president just tweeted. He called you fake news."
Great.
So it was very effective. In fact, when we were breaking up that meeting at the White House, Vice President Pence stopped, turned around, and he punches me in the chest. And he says, "That was a great ad. We talked about it for days." So it had the impact we wanted to. It ultimately led to this executive order that I think will be just the first of many executive orders that will be targeting these employment visa programs.
So the president basically saw the ad, first thought it was fake news, looked into it, decided, hey, this is really an issue, and it's making me look bad because I campaign on a platform of American workers first, protecting American workers. So he took steps, and what did he decide to do?
Well, his decision was to do an executive order that would impact federal agencies. So if they were going to use outside contractors, they would have to demonstrate that these firms weren't displacing Americans, and not just for that contract, but overall. Because let me give you an example. Capgemini is one of the firms I had mentioned that would be one of the outsourcers at TVA. In the last 3 months, I spoke to 3 former Capgemini workers, all of them U.S. citizens, 2 of them naturalized, one of them actually from South Asia. Mm-hmm. And all 3 were laid off. One fellow was laid off, and they brought in 2 H-1B visa holders to do his work. The other 2 were working on a contract site where they didn't lay off. There was all H-1Bs. They didn't lay off any of the H-1Bs, but they laid off the Americans. So that's how these firms respond to a downturn in the economy. So obviously, the H-1Bs are there for them to save money. They view their Americans as being expensive, undeserving, and expendable. So this is exactly what the president's order will stop for those that are contracting with the federal government.
Well, it's interesting because we've seen now this H-1B abuse going on for quite some time, as I say, decades. And yet It seems like in Congress, we've only had a few senators who've been concerned about this. No matter how many times we raise it here at FAIR, that this kind of abuse is going on, they continue to be of the view that somehow the H-1B program overall is important, even if there's a few bad actors out there. Now, do you think the pandemic and the fact that so many Americans are unemployed, while the corporate lobbyists continue to push for H-1Bs, is exposing the reality of how this H-1B stuff, in general, the foreign worker visa programs are actually operating? And do you think the public is aware of this?
I think when you look at your level of customer support through this, I was on the Hilton Hotel site the other day, and I'm getting 404 errors as I'm trying to book a hotel room. What we're finding, you had talked about pulling off the bandages. And ultimately, these outsourcings always lead ultimately to the offshoring. Because for every H-1B visa worker here, there are at least 3 or 5 people in India supporting them.
Right.
One tech worker took me into a government office, a tech shop, and he said, Kev, don't record anything, just I want to show you this. So we walked in and everyone's on the phone. And I'm like, yeah, we walk out in the hall. I go, oh, they're slacking off. He goes, no, Kev, they're not slacking off. Their code writing skills are so bad that they're on the phone with tech support back in India. So the guys back in India are writing their code for them. Now, with this pandemic, Dan, this is the great thing. What all these financial, like Wells Fargo is a great example where, you know, they've all got these wonderful, beautiful campuses in like Hyderabad. Well, during COVID, your folks have to work from home. Here in the United States, people are working remotely from home. Some companies did it better than others, but you know, we all have access to electrical power, internet. That's not the case with India. Many of these workers, and I'll give you, as one fellow from a large technology company explained it to me, many have to be bussed into these campuses as far as it's a 1.5 hour bus ride. So they actually get there late in the day and they have to feed them breakfast because they've been on the bus. And then they have to also leave early to catch the bus, because if they don't, you know, how are they going to, they won't be able to get home. So the productivity, the actual day where there's actual productivity going on is really shortened over there. Now add to that, if they have to attempt for these guys to work from home, it's an impossible situation. So that's, you know, COVID-19 has certainly exposed the ills of offshoring. And the fact that we as a country, because the pushback that I will get, because you have to be somewhere concerned about the security, because what they'll say is, oh no, all the servers are here in the US and they're just being accessed virtually over there. Well, I don't know. Can we really feel that comfortable about that? And also, again, where are all the controls? And this is another country. I mean, imagine, look at the situation we had where we couldn't even make face masks. Imagine all of our financial data, all of our insurance data, all of our healthcare data residing over, you know, being accessed overseas. It's crazy.
Well, so if you're an American worker and you've been working for a company for a while and you see what's going on, you see that they're planning to fire a bunch of you and have you train replacements and get you to sign a severance agreement as a condition of training replacements and not speaking out. Do you have an alternative, and what should people do?
It's really difficult, because when we launched US Tech Workers a couple years ago, we did the Bay Area Rapid Transit ads, which garnered an awful lot of publicity for us. When I would meet with tech workers there, they'd say, well, this is the thing, Kev. If I stick my head up, I'll get blacklisted. If I get blacklisted, I'll never work in this town again. And the tech workers themselves are a community that, you know, personally, if you're an engineer, you're a tech worker, you're probably not thinking about socializing with your colleagues. You're thinking about solving the problems in front of you, writing a program, and moving on to the next one. And so these companies have been very effective in picking off workers one by one and keeping them afraid of collective action. But I think that could be changing. The New York Post had an article last night where they talk about a GE plant in Schenectady, New York, where when the workers found out what was going on at TVA, they were talking, because their jobs were being offshored to Poland. Mm-hmm. And they were like, you know, what can we do to get President Trump here to help us? So I think the notion of workers coming together collectively may be gaining some steam out there, because without collective action, you're doomed. My thought had always been, you know, we saw what happened at Disney, where they outsourced, brought in the outsourcing company, people trained their replacements. Well, what if there was an agitator there that said, look, if we don't all hang together, we're all going to hang. So let's tomorrow just say, look, this deal is terminated, or we all walk out. And we're going to walk out today, and we're going to walk out together. Because, Dan, that's the only way to fight this. Short of that, we have to go the legislative route. You had mentioned Senator Lee's bill, which is S386, which is HR 1044 with Lee's amendments, which is essentially rewarding all of this bad behavior. And the reason they want to get rid of the country caps, because the Indians are hitting the ceiling with the EB2 green card, the employment-based green cards. And what will happen is, if Lee's bill goes through, for the next 10 years, only Indians will be getting employment-based green cards. And the reason that exists is because
that will produce another legislative package to increase the number of, EB green cards and statutory.
Well, that's exactly what will happen, Dan, because the rest of the world will say, wait a minute, we're sitting in this queue for 16 years now. You just have to increase. And that was where we saw the Relief Act come in.
That's like the early filer status that they have, too, that is apparently a diabolical creation.
Absolutely. So it's but
look at the politics of it. I mean, we have at the moment a president who seems like mostly cares about this. He certainly did back in 2016, and has from time to time, and seems to be torquing up his interest again as we get closer to the election. Where's Joe Biden stand on this whole question?
I did a blog on Joe Biden's immigration policy as he revealed it on his website, and it's lights out for the American worker. It will be absolutely unbridled immigration. I didn't see restrictive measures of any kind in any of Joe Biden's planks.
So he basically would want to go back to the status quo on H-1B workers and let them come pouring in.
Oh, he's bought off on the myth that America doesn't have the skilled workers, and that's pure mythology.
He was also one of the engineers behind the Wilberforce Anti-Trafficking Act, right? And he likes in-country asylum processing in Central America. So people have not had a chance to look at the Biden immigration platform. Please take the time to read. It's long, but it's important that you be aware of what is in the platform, because forewarned is forearmed. If you're not aware of what he is planning to do when he's president, shame on you. You shouldn't even think about voting if you haven't read the platform of both candidates.
Well, my question for you, Dan, is it his platform, or is it simply the deep state platform?
The Unity platform was developed mostly with deference to the Bernie people and the other assorted special interests that make up the party apparatchiks, fellow travelers, and the comrades. So,
now, Dan, you've been around this for a while. Bernie used to get it. He understood that open borders, that doubling, tripling, quadrupling the number of employment visas was a Koch brothers scheme. What happened to him?
Look, we live in a world where a small group of people get all the attention on social media, outsized influence of people who are very loud and well organized, even though they're a small number. You see that in Portland, you see that in places now. And certainly when people talk about Trump's base, political base, they say, well, he can't offend his base. Well, I mean, the Democrats have an energized base, which happens to be on the extreme and far radical left. And that's what has driven Bernie's candidacy now for 2 consecutive election terms. Biden understands that there was a deal made. Obama picked up the phone and consolidated Biden's control early on in the nominating process. And part of the deal was all those folks are going to get their shot at writing the platform. And Biden's just, Obama's kind of calling the shots, and Biden's kind of a windsock who just, he's like a puppet. He's just there as a mask, if you will, to mask the ultimate agenda that you now see.
He's actually, in many respects, I think, just a fitting candidate for the times.
If he can maintain enough intellectual coherence to actually take the oath when the time comes. But the point is, if folks really want to know what the agenda is, they need to read the platform. and pay attention to it. And I'm not here to tell you who to vote for. FAIR doesn't endorse candidates, and neither does U.S. tech workers, I'm assuming.
Nope, not at all.
But the truth of the matter is, as a policy matter, there are plenty of things in the platform that we don't agree with, and I think that will be pretty apparent to anybody who knows FAIR and who bothers to read the platform. Any last final thoughts there? How can we replicate it, and where do people need to go to find you?
Absolutely. Well, they can find us at www.ustechworkers.com. We are very active on social media. We are always on Twitter. We're on Facebook, and YouTube. We do videos every once in a while. We're doing a lot more. It's interesting how to replicate. Well, I think we got lucky in a lot of ways, but you have to be out there looking for these opportunities, and we have to connect. There's a tendency, if you like social media, to think, oh, I've tweeted, I did a post on Facebook, that's enough. No, you got to get out on the ground. You got to be meeting with people. You got to be meeting with For me, I like to talk to attorneys, because as I'm talking to activists that are running into EEOC complaints like country of origin discrimination, genderism, racism, in these environments that are now dominated by employment visa holders, I'm able to get those to attorneys. And Dan, thank you to there's an organization associated with FAIR called EARLY, the Immigration Reform Law Institute, and they have been wonderful. Several times I've had activists say, hey, I need some help. I'd like someone to look at this contract they're offering me. And I called Laura at EARLY, and she hooked them up, and they got a great result. And along those lines, one of the things people can do, there's a fellow in Dallas. He was working for the big financial company, and they just laid him off. And he knew what it was. He was a U.S. citizen. But he fought back. He had a lawyer send a letter in, and he got $40,000 to keep his mouth shut. So, there are things we can do. They're breaking the law out there. So the more information we have.
They should definitely contact you, though, if they're looking for help. How many folks do you talk to every week?
Well, I talked to 3 people this morning before our call. I'll probably talk to another 10 before the end of the day. And we also have a group of activists. We call them the SWAT team. They've been wonderful when things are going on across the country where people need to call in, get on social media, get out and meet and interact with their legislators. They've been just absolutely wonderful with that.
Well, this has been great, Kevin. That's U.S. Tech Workers that I'm talking to, Kevin Lynn, who's the founder of U.S. Tech Workers, and we're talking about his meeting with Donald Trump and Donald Trump's response in trying to help preserve American jobs for American workers. I'm Dan Stein. I'm at www.fairus.org. If you're watching this on YouTube, you certainly want to hit our subscribe button and see all the content coming from FAIR to you every day, all the time. Again, I'm Dan Stein, and thanks for watching. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Dan.